The title of this presentation is Japanese Americans Cultural Identity Maintenance by Kiana Sharmeta Izliah, Hodges University, Com 4017 Intercultural Communications, Professor A. Fortin. Konnichiwa, o genki desu ka? Since we are not in Japan, allow me to say again, hello, how are you doing? Tonight we will be discussing the maintenance of Japanese cultural identity in an ever-changing global community. We will define Japanese culture, the history of the first Japanese Americans, Japanese business practices, and the next generation of Japanese. By clicking the link underneath the picture, you can view a short picture film of Japan. Cultural identification has been defined by scholars the world over in so many ways that it is sometimes unclear what component makes an individual a part of a culture. However, the Japanese culture has specific guidelines that make it rather simple for those within and without the culture to identify who or what is Japanese. This concept is known as Nihonjinran. There are four tenets that make up the foundation. Homogeneity. Japanese are a homogeneous and unique people. Blood. Japanese blood is essential for mutual communication, mutual understanding, understanding of the culture, and appearance as Japanese. Cultural competence. Foreigners are incapable of fully understanding Japanese culture or mastering the language. Finally, social participation. The sociocultural territoriality of Japan should be defended and foreigners excluded in the areas of marriage, employment, teaching, and political and artistic leadership. Nihonjinran and the foundational tenets of homogeneity, blood, cultural competence, and social participation are structural in the practices of Bushido. Bushido is the way of the warrior and at the heart of Japanese culture. The way of the warrior was followed through many different faculties, a total of 7, and they differ depending on the author. McCran called them loyalty, courage, humility, forbearance, generosity, and self-control. Olmitskin called it justice, bravery, benevolence, veracity, politeness, honor, and loyalty. In Japan, relationships are directly affected by duty and obligation. If duty and obligation are dishonored, then shame is not only brought upon an individual but his entire family and lineage. In duty-based relationships, what other people believe or think has a more powerful impact on behavior than what the individual believes. Shame occurs through others' negative feelings towards you or through your feelings of having failed to live up to your obligations. In Western culture, guilt can be relieved through confession, self-righteousness, or the justice system. But in Japanese culture, shame cannot be removed until a person does what society expects, which may include drastic measures such as committing suicide. With such a deep-rooted tradition of shame, honor, and duty, it is easy to imagine the first Japanese immigrants toiling in the Hawaiian plantations to restore honor to themselves after illegally leaving their beloved Japan. Leaving Japan was illegal because Japan had maintained an official policy of isolation from Europe and most of its colonies, and immigration was strictly controlled from 1639 until 1853. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the U.S. Navy sailed gunships right into Tokyo Harbor, forcing a reclusive nation to open itself up to trade with the U.S., and incidentally provided the people of Japan with an unprecedented glimpse of an alien culture. The first generation Japanese Americans were called Issei. In Hawaii, there was no threat of fear or racial violence, as there was on the mainland, where other immigrants went further and settled in California, Oregon, and Washington. Because Hawaii was not a U.S. territory at the time, the Japanese immigrants were able to maintain cultural identity outside of Japan and Hawaii. they confidently transplanted their traditions to their new home. Buddhist temples sprung up on every plantation, many of which also had their own resident Buddhist priests. The second generation of Japanese Americans were called Nisei, who were born U.S. citizens and were more likely to speak English than Japanese, more likely to practice Christianity than Buddhism, and more likely to prefer American food, sports, music, and social mores than those of Japanese tradition. Many Nisei struggled to reconcile the conflicting demands of their complex cultural heritage. However, they overwhelmingly identified themselves as Japanese Americans, not as Japanese in America. The bombing at Pearl Harbor in 1941 caused the U.S. military to seize the opportunity to put a halt to the growth and advancement of Japanese Americans. Yet, the Nisei went on to rebuild Japanese American commerce. Moving into the 21st century, we realize that Japan has grown exponentially from the mentality of the legendary samurai to a new age boasting of technological advances and a hub for cultural change. The imperialistic attitude of Japanese leaders led to the destruction of Japan during World War II with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. However, by 1952, Japan was once again under Japanese control. It had a solid, if small, industrial base, a coherent government, and strong allies. In many ways, this could have been accepted as a sufficient victory, but it turned out to be only the starting point. Japan was amazingly about to take off. From utter devastation, Japan rose like a phoenix, partly of its own volition. In every aspect of business and technology, Japan began to flourish. New developments in agriculture, manufacturing, and trade contributed to the rapid growth of the Japanese economy, as well as Japan having a more educated workforce than Western cultures resulted in Japan leading developments in technology and innovation. Almost all Japanese business organizations hold to the cultural characteristics in business known as Ringo Sato and Keigi, which are business practice of group decision making and face to face conferences. Although criticized, these cultural characteristics evidently contribute to the success of Japanese business. The Ringy style of decision making is deeply rooted in Japanese culture, which emphasizes interpersonal harmony, cooperation, and consistency. The decision making process is based on a series of informal gatherings that build interpersonal relationships that will result in the keiji or face to face conference that finalize all terms discussed during informal meetings. The gatherings are critical to the maintenance of close interpersonal relationships within the organization. These practices may seem unethical from a business partner vantage point, especially in a global economy, but these practices have proven to be successful, and even though younger generations of Japanese are more open to change and welcome the opportunities for globalization and relocation, as with most collective cultures, as one ages, they become more conservative. As younger Japanese join established economic and political institutions, they are likely to become more conservative in outlook and espouse more conservative values, in short, the tenets of Nihonjinran. The younger generation of Japanese, both in Japan and abroad, are often viewed as a generation that has strayed away from tradition. Yet obligations to family, school, employer, and friends still tend to guide most Japanese behavior. Although there are many economic factors contributing to the assimilation and watering down of Japanese traditional culture, studies show that the younger generation in years to come will tend to behave more and more like the older generation, subsequently allowing Japan to forever remain a culture of shame, honor, and duty. Finally, the new Japan is a nation revered and imitated, not because of its ferocity, but because of their adherence to their culture. Japanese cultural identity is based largely on the religious nationalism and importance of the group. In spite of Japanese ideals of imperialism, which ultimately caused its destruction on more than one occasion. The foundations of unity and loyalty that imperialism stems from has never been broken. In just half a century, Japan made quite a comeback after thousands of years of imperialism, strict control. The poor treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II and subsequent bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki resulted in worldwide sympathy for Japan. Japan has been able to change its face as a result. No longer is Japan feared, but it is revered as a popular culture hub of inventions, rising from the technological advances in East Asia. Contrary to popular belief that Japanese tradition is falling by the wayside due to globalization, an interview of youth from Hong Kong recorded a youngster to say, "We can never be Americans, but maybe one day we can be like the Japanese."